Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's really an honor to be with all of you today. And as Julie said, we are looking at Parashat Yitro this week, which has one of our most foundational narratives in it about Matan Torah, the revelation of Torah on Mount Sinai. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of an exploration of that narrative, and particularly verses in the middle of the 19th chapter of Exodus, which seemed to imply that women were not part of were not part of the people receiving Torah on Mount Sinai. And so I wanted to explore a few sources with us, or with all of you this morning, that relate to this question. Both the three sources we'll be looking at in particular are all classic feminist sources. And I also want to just lift up that Judy Klitzner Pardes really led me to some of this. So I am very grateful to her. And I am very excited to be teaching this Torah. We're going to start by reading a few verses in the book of Exodus in the 19th chapter. I'm going to be reading in the English. And this is, I believe, the JPS translation from Sefaria. And I'm reading in the English for ease of understanding for everyone. I don't assume that we all have the same Hebrew level. So feel free to either just listen or follow along with me. And I'm going to be starting with Exodus 19:10, and I'll be reading through verse 13. I'll be pausing at verse 13, and then I'm going to pick up with 14 and 15. So starting in chapter 19, verse 10. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes. Let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be either stoned or shot, beast or man, he shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain." So I'm going to pause us there. So here we have a conversation between God and Moses, in which God is giving Moses instructions around what the people should do to prepare for the revelation of Torah. And just to take a step back, we often, in our context, we often think of this as a really amazing, momentous, holy, beautiful event. We all receive Torah together with all of our senses, the thunder, the lightning, the sound, all of those things. And because this was a collective experience, we tend, in our own perception and conception of it, we tend to think about the majesty of it, the holiness of it. And I think it's important for us to remember that our ancestors were probably terrified out of their minds. They had just been freed from slavery 7 weeks prior. So here they are, they're, at the foot of this mountain, not allowed to touch it, not allowed to approach it, and, waiting for this third momentous day when this revelation from God's going to come down, and they don't know what to expect. So I think we should just hold that in our minds. So we have here the dialogue between Moses and God, and God is giving Moses instructions. Hold that in your mind. This is what the Torah is saying is the dialogue between Moses and God. Now we're going to hear in the next source the way in which Moses gives that to the people. So starting with Exodus 19:14, Moses came down from the mountain to the people and warned the people to stay pure, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, "Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman." So we have a very interesting contrast here, right? We have on the one hand, God saying to Moses, here are the things people need to do. They need to be pure. They need to wash their clothes. They need to not touch the mountain or the border of it. Anybody who approaches it will be put to death. Of course, the language there is quite harsh. So hold that also. But then we have Moses relaying parts of this. Be ready for the third day, be pure, don't go near a woman. So for those of us who are really interested in inclusion and who are interested in hearing all voices and in feminist Torah understanding and scholarship, this is a deeply, deeply troubling verse. So before we pause for comments, I want to read us a piece from Judith Plaskow. And Judith Plaskow, for those who are not aware, is a very classic Jewish feminist scholar. She wrote in 1990 a book called Standing Again at Sinai, which since its publication 31 years ago remains a feminist classic. There are a lot of other books in the realm of women's studies in Judaism and feminist understandings of Torah that have come after Standing Again at Sinai, but Standing Again at Sinai is truly a classic. So here's a bit of an excerpt from that related directly to the verse we just read. There is perhaps no verse in the Torah more disturbing, to the feminist than Moses' warning to his people in Exodus 19:15. Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. For here, at the very moment that the Jewish people stand at Mount Sinai ready to enter into the covenant, Moses addresses the community only as men. At the central moment of Jewish history, women are invisible. This verse sets forth a pattern recapitulated again and again in Jewish sources. On the one hand, of course we were there. On the other, how is it then that the text could imply we were not there? So just to unpack this a bit. So Plaskow notes a couple of important things. So first of all, that at this moment of profound covenantal relationship, we are about to truly enter into this new relationship with God as a people. And Moses is directing instructions to the but the is only referring to men. What does that mean? We know that women were there, says Plaskow, but what does it mean that we have this textual pattern that gets recapitulated over and over again, where in classical rabbinic and Jewish text, women's voices are not heard and women are invisible? How do we reconcile the reality that we were in fact there and at the same time that we don't have that recorded in our tradition? And this is certainly a question that has been central for me and central for many others in this work. And there are lots of different approaches. We'll be looking at an approach from Phyllis Tribble in a moment, who is another feminist Bible scholar. But I want to open it up I want to take a couple of comments now, before I give some of my thoughts on this. I want to take a couple of comments, and in order to do that, if people could raise their Zoom hand, and then Julie, if you could just call on folks, please just try to keep your comments brief because we want to hear from as many people as we can and we don't have a ton of time, but I would love to hear from a few folks now before we move on to a few other sources.
Bia Mia.
Hi, this is Bamaya. I was wondering if, oh no, that's okay. I was wondering if maybe this is part of an issue that we see again and again with Moses, like, you know, when we're looking at Shabbat and how we're getting, you know, our commandments at his last words at Deuteronomy. Like, I wonder, is this another one of those, it sounds different from how we got it the first time?
That's entirely possible. Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. How do we compare this to other instances in which Moses has relayed information to the people, like what you named about Shabbat? I think that that is entirely true. I often think of this, perhaps a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as kind of like that game of telephone, right? You could look at it that way, right? You know, when you're a kid and you're playing that game of telephone and you're supposed to whisper to the person, and there's a phrase that gets whispered around a circle, and by the time it gets to the last person, it's completely different from the original comment. So, you know, in an interesting way, there could be a disconnect between the transmission between God and Moses, for sure. That's certainly a possibility.
Would anyone else like to make a comment or ask a question? If you can't find the raise hand function, you can just let me know in the chat that you'd like to make a comment. Barry. Barry Elbaum. Barry, you see the unmute button?
How's that?
There you go.
There you are.
Hi. So I would just comment that the statement to not go near a woman, could that be interpreted as an issue of purity for the revelation and the that moment, as opposed to eliminating or not acknowledging women? Because there's other statements further along in the Parsha where the people collectively are addressed and not just men. So certainly there's so many places in Torah where women are kind of secondary. But I think that we can look at this and perhaps interpret it as an issue of being pure and presenting yourself at that moment as pure for both men and women. And that's just another way that we might look at it. And how would you comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Barry. So what I'm hearing you suggest is that actually this is very much about sexual purity and celibacy, perhaps even in the first few days, or it could even be related to Nidah, which we don't hear about until later in Leviticus, but it has to do with menstruation and a lot of laws and regulations around that, which we're not going to get into right now. But I think that is certainly a possibility that this could have something to do with wanting to remain separate from sexuality, or to remain pure in some way. Now, there are always like lots of different ways people understand these words and these readings. And actually, I think that that is a really good segue into our next source, which in some ways is a response to Plaskow. There are lots of different feminist responses to Plaskow, both when she wrote and in the years after. And she's still very much active in the feminist academic sphere. And as more women in different religious communities have become more engaged in Torah study, there have been an increasing number of reflections. And so this particular piece from Phyllis Tribble is interesting. She herself is actually Unitarian. She is not Jewish, but she is very involved in feminist interpretation. And so, Barry, to your question and comment, which I really appreciate, I think this can offer a possible response and a different way of reading the text. So I'm going to go ahead and read this piece. The women's movement, I don't know when this was written, so just to name that, I'm not sure when Phyllis Tribble wrote this. The women's movement errs when it dismisses the Bible as inconsequential or condemns it as enslaving. In rejecting scripture, women ironically accept male chauvinistic interpretations and thereby capitulate to the very view they are protesting. But there is another way to reread, not rewrite the Bible without the blinders. The hermeneutical challenge is to translate biblical faith without sexism. So here, what Phyllis Tribble is suggesting is that we can go back to the text, look at it in context, try to really get at what's going on here, and ask ourselves, how do we reread this very consequential text? When we dismiss it out of hand, on the one hand, so if in some, and I emphasize some because feminism is an umbrella term, I certainly identify as a feminist, and it is a very umbrella term. There are all different kinds of ways of approaching feminism. There are Orthodox feminists, there are non-Orthodox religious feminists, there are non-religious feminists, like the spectrum is wide. And so that spectrum is absolutely going to affect how people approach these texts. So I think what Tribble is really challenging us to do is to actually try as best as we can, and I think it's hard to do because I think as human beings, we are often prone to do this, but I think we are being asked to acknowledge that we are reading from our own experience and try to put that aside so that we are able to encounter the text again as ready for that encounter as possible. And so I think on the other end, we have folks who are more traditionalists and may have a more apologetic interpretation. So you see that a lot as well. And the work that we need to do, I believe, is we need to be very honest, very intellectually honest, unapologetic, and really struggle with the difficult pieces of Torah. I think of being in relationship with Torah as very much like being in relationship in general. Inevitably, conflicts are going to arise. Inevitably, there are going to be troubling texts. This is certainly far from the only troubling verse in the Torah. So the question for those of us who are in relationship with this ancient text that is relevant to us today, what do we do with these challenging and really troubling texts? So there are a variety of responses that have come up, and we're gonna be exploring one of them in a moment. But I want to offer just a few comments of my own about these texts. So there are traditional understandings that talk about the children of Jacob and the house of Israel as referring to men and women respectively, so that everybody is part of this revelation, especially because we know that women were in fact at Sinai. So that is something that we can take into consideration also when we think about revelation. Revelation itself is both collective and individual. So we have a collective accounting. We were all at Sinai. That's what the tradition teaches us. We all were there to receive Torah. Of course, here we have this verse that's suggesting that women were not there. But then, of course, as Plaska was reminding us, women in fact were there. So what does it mean when the Torah does not record everything? And I believe this is where our tradition flourishes when it creates modern Midrash and classic Midrash. And Midrash are texts that seek to fill in gaps in narrative. There are a couple of kinds of Midrash. For our purposes, we're going to be thinking about Midrash Agadah, which are imperfectly translated. They are more narrative form. There are also midrashim called Midrash Halacha, and those are more legal, and they have a lot of exegetical techniques, and you see them a lot in the Haggadah for Pesach, actually. And so when we get to that point, maybe we can do an exploration of that. But for today's purposes, Midrash can fill in the gaps that the narrative or the Torah text is leaving us. And they allow us to ask the questions, who are we not hearing from in this moment of revelation? Who do we know was there, but we do not hear their experiences? So in that vein, I'm going to read now a poem that is one of many modern midrashic answers to this question. And it's written by a woman named Merle Feld, who, if you're not familiar with Merle Feld, she is really an incredible author, seeker, teacher of Torah, teacher of spiritual writing processes, really just fantastic. And this is one of the poems that I think is probably most well known of hers. And it talks about revelation at Sinai. And it's written, her imagined narrator is someone who is at Sinai, is a woman, is thinking about these issues. And so we're going to read the poem, and as I'm reading, I want us all to be thinking about our own perspectives on these things. What does it mean for the text to not always record all of the voices? What does it mean for transmission between God and Moses to be so different? So I'm gonna read that, and we will go from there. So this again is a Merle Feld poem. We all stood together. So it's kind of a play on the idea of we all were at Sinai. My brother and I were at Sinai. My brother and I were all at Sinai. He kept a journal of what he saw, of what he heard, of what it all meant to him. I wish I had such a record of what happened to me there. It seems like every time I want to write, I can't. I'm always holding a baby, one of my own or one for a friend. Always holding a baby. So my hands are never free to write things down. And then, as time passes, the particulars, the hard data, the who, what, when, where, why, slip away from me. And all I'm left with is the feeling. But feelings are just sounds. The vowel, the vowel barking of a mute. My brother is so sure of what he heard. After all, he's got a record of it. Consonant after consonant after consonant. If we remembered it together, we could recreate Holy Time, Sparks line. So right here we have exactly one of the challenges. What does it mean when you actually, as Merle Feld is so beautifully illustrating for us, what does it mean when you actually can't or don't have the time to write things down because you're doing other things, you're holding babies, you're taking care of household chores, you're so preoccupied with just the daily life. And so often, I think that's one of the many reasons we lose women's wisdom over time. Because the only folks who are able to record what they had, what they saw, what they felt are people who had that leisure time. So what we are left with is a small portion of what was always there. And so we have to think in our Torah, how do we take this sacred text and really make it come alive and speak to all who were at Sinai? And I think this is an endeavor that we have to just keep on working through. And today we are so privileged to live in a time when more and more women are learning Torah than ever before, which is, I think, just a tremendous blessing and long overdue and a tremendous gift to the Jewish people, women of all different religious perspectives and persuasions, and every single woman who's learning Torah is adding her own holy voice to this conversation that we've been having for 3,000 years. And every single woman who's learning Torah is unearthing all of that her ancestors and our ancestors really passed down to us that we may not have had recorded, but we now are able to add our voices to this dialogue and this conversation, which is so incredible and revelatory all its own. And on that note, I'm going to pause here and I'm going to invite anyone who has a comment in our last few minutes together before we close at the hour, if anyone has any comments or questions or reflections.
Great. So, Rosa.
So I took the poem. I thought the poem was very powerful. And I took the poem more as a reference to the fact that all of, well, I would say probably 99.999% of all Torah commentators up to this day are men. And part of that is probably due to the fact that in the old world, in the ancient world, women really were discounted. And even when they began to be counted, Judaism didn't seem to do that, especially not with Torah study. And I think perhaps had women been writing the commentaries, had they been encouraged to write the commentaries, we would have a totally different view of the Torah.
I think you're very right about that, Rosa. And I think you raise really important points that I think if women had been at the table from the very get-go, we would have a very different view of Torah. And rabbinic tradition over the several thousand years we've had it really did discount and exclude women in pretty tremendous ways and ways that have continued to be with us to this day. And so I really appreciate what you're saying. I think you're absolutely correct. And I think that therefore it's our responsibility to start really investigating and adding our voices and trying to do a little bit of that repair and that tikkun. So thank you.
Steve, I know earlier you had a comment or a question. I don't know if you still did.
Yeah, it was at that point, it was about the house of Jacob. But I've been thinking about what's been said here and just doing the research. So just want to add another thought here and hear what the rabbi's perspective is. I mean, now with Disney putting their films in context from 50 years ago, and Gone with the Wind having a little notice up front, setting that in the context of its time. I'm just wondering about just thoughts in general about putting present day wisdom, looking at it in biblical times. And how can you, I mean, which is fine, but why not put the times of the Bible in its historical context about what life was like there? There were definitely ways society operated. I'm just wondering if we kind of learn that, you know, from an anthropological perspective or biblical archaeology, and then you kind of know where this is coming from, because after all, it was from thousands of years ago, and societies were what they were back then. And I'm just wondering about the thoughts of trying to look at that, what we're reading, with the eyes from today without that same kind of context that we put on films from 50 years ago.
I absolutely agree that context is really important, and there are a lot of biblical scholars and rabbis and academics who have done that work exactly of contextualizing the narrative. One of the things that I think makes the Torah a little bit of a different experience and a bit of a different conversation is that in addition to the very necessary historical contextualization, which I think we have what we have from that period, like from when, we have what we have from the context in which the Torah emerges, right? And certainly there are lots of scholars that are doing work on that. And we also are continuing to interact with this text in religious ways today. So it's important to both have the contextual piece of it and to think about where is this historically situated? What was the culture? What was the society, the structure, all of those things. And for those of us who are still very much deeply enmeshed and in relationship with this text, and it guides our lives in very deep ways today, it's really important that we are continuing to engage with that thousands of years of lengths of tradition so that we are both aware of context and we are aware of the continual relationship between us and this text, which even though the written Torah is fixed and doesn't change and hasn't changed, the oral Torah, which we can think of expansively, we can either think of that as rabbinic text, Talmud and Midrash and all of those things, which traditionalists would say also came down at Mount Sinai, or we can take a bit more of an expansive view of oral Torah and say that oral Torah includes everything that's coming after written Torah ad hayom until today. So I think you're absolutely right to ask about historical context. It's very, very important. It actually, I think, really helps us better situate the narrative. And we have the separate question of the religious responses to a text within and beyond its context. So thank you so much for that question.